I'm currently reading a book, Mississippi Hippie, A Life in 49 Pieces by Willie Bearden, originally from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. It's a series of vignettes, a lot of them about growing up in Rolling Fork, but one of the vignettes, named The Anomaly of the Delta, describes the Delta, what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. So I'd like to read to you Willie Bearden's The Anomaly of the Delta from his book Mississippi Hippie, A Life in 49 Pieces. In the past 20 years or so, I've talked a lot about the Delta. I've written scripts for films, dozens of text panels for museums, books about blues and cotton culture. I've interviewed hundreds of people about some aspect of Southern culture or agricultural technology or art, and been invited to participate in panel discussions on the why and how of the Delta. I think the one revelation I've come to after these many hours and days and weeks of thinking about the place where I was born and raised is the fact that it ever worked at all. The question usually has something to do with the Delta of ruin, the Delta of yesterday, the Delta of legend, the Delta of nostalgia. Maybe the decline of the diverse culture and small-town atmosphere in the Delta is not the story. That so many unique elements came together at one time is the real story, and hence the anomaly. The fact that the Yazoo Mississippi River Delta was not inhabited in any great measure until around the turn of the 20th century, and then by arguably the most eclectic and diverse group of immigrants, ne'er-do-wells, ex-enslaved, second sons of wealthy families, and wandering souls who were just looking to catch some traction somewhere is the real story. Had it not been for the second slavery, or sharecropping as they rechristened it, none of this would have ever come about. There are a few inflection points, most notably just after the Civil War, then at the end of the Reconstruction debacle, next during the 1890s through the early teens, when the Civil War conveniently got rewritten and the newly minted myth was roundly embraced by whites in the South, or after World War I, when black soldiers returning from Europe were faced with renewed discrimination, or after World War II, when again African Americans helped to win the war and came home to a country where they had no voice, no vote, no opportunity, and no prospects. Who knows how better their lives would have been in the North or in the West? The sad fact is that it wasn't until the mid-1960s that the Delta African Americans were dismissed, finally thrown away when the cotton picker and herbicides took away the only reasons in the mind of their oppressors for blacks to be in the Delta at all, to chop and pick cotton and to cook and housekeep for white families. Never mind the decades of familiar ties to that crescent of land. No thought of the contributions and unrealized potential of the majority of people who live there. It is a sad, missed opportunity, yet that doesn't even approach the gravity of the situation. When I was a kid in the 1950s and 1960s, every one of those little Delta towns ran on what I called the $3 a day economy. You chop cotton from early June till the crops are laid by in mid-July. You make $3 a day, 7 in the morning till 6 in the evening, 5 days a week, half day on Saturday, half hour for whatever lunch you brought that day. Everybody drinks out of the dipper and the 5-gallon galvanized bucket. It might even have a little ice in it. 50 or 60 people in the field, kids, mamas, grandmas. Old men who can't work much anymore are the keepers of the file and will sharpen your hoe when you need it. The rows are sometimes a mile long, the sun hot, the dust deep, so you slide your bare feet along under the coolness of the dust. Not much singing going on in the fields, much to the chagrin of the ethnomuseologist who like to paint an alternate picture. No coded song lyrics or field hollers about the man, just groups of friends and neighbors working along, talking about what people talk about. Come Saturday at dinner time, lunch for those of you not from the South, they pay off and every person takes their little bit and spends it uptown and Rolling Fork. Groceries, cornmeal, and flour, neck bones, lard, maybe some jawbreakers or 2 for a penny cookies from the store, marbles and plastic toys, hair pomade, stockings, new pair of shoes, a straw hat, a new Sunday outfit, maybe even the picture show, all spent in a 3 or 4 block area where the streets are still crowded at 10 o'clock on Saturday night. The cafes where the jukebox thumps and smoked sausage sandwiches and quarts of beer are relished, pushing on through the night, providing the only respite from a life that is harder than any of you can imagine. And fights. Why, somebody would put a knot on your head if you looked at them wrong or said something stupid. In the juke joints, an ice pick or straight razor was the weapon of choice. The storekeepers knew that this was the time to make money, get all you could from these newly wealthy people. It wouldn't last long, 6 or 8 weeks, but the influx of money was as good as at Christmas time. The cotton picking money ran out by the mid-60s, when most farmers in the Delta had a mechanical picker, and the chopping money died a rapid death when the U.S. Congress passed the minimum wage for agricultural workers bill, which in 1965 was $1 per hour. The $3 a day economy was dead, and within a couple of years, the small towns in the Delta began a slow and painful death that has lasted more than 50 years. The stores on China Street in Rolling Fork closed one by one. The last was Sam's Singing Company in 2015, the last of the 4 Chinese-owned grocery stores that gave the main drag in Rolling Fork its name. But before that, Mr. Sam Rosenthal's dry goods store closed. Then his sister's store, the Price Right store, closed its pink doors, and Danzig's Furniture and Lamendorf's weren't far behind. Mr. Denton closed the Five and Dime store in the 80s, and Ashley's Rexall moved out on the highway where there was thought to be more traffic, and then closed as well. Most of the grocery stores had long since closed. All of the little stores and shops were gone by the early 90s. Most downtown areas are now abandoned, and only chain stores like Dollar General or Family Dollar are left out on the highway to chew the last bits of commerce out of the communities. When the growing and harvesting cotton demanded great numbers of people, the Delta thrived. Mechanization certainly improved farming techniques and the agricultural economy, but in the end it exacted a huge toll on human capital. It is estimated that over 6 million African Americans fled the rural South between 1910 and 1970, with 2.4 million leaving in the 1960s. As the northern cities where many of these migrants settled began to deindustrialize and manufacturing jobs moved offshore, opportunities were hard to come by, and great numbers of people fell into poverty. This time, though, it wasn't just black people. It was the working class former union workers who got talked into voting against the union or settling for a lopsided contract or not complaining loud enough when those corporations they had relied on for generations simply locked the doors and moved away. No retraining, no penalties. The only people who won and continue to win are the stockholders in those companies who don't care how much the industries have to hop to the next poor society to keep those profit margins healthy. All of a sudden, Ohio, West Virginia, and Michigan look a lot like 1960s Mississippi. The Delta was built on exploitation. Strike that. America was built on exploitation. Strike that. The world was built on exploitation. But that subject is too simple or complex for me to deal with here. When I think about my place, the Mississippi Delta, it's clear that the task of taming a swampy, heavily forested region that runs some 200 miles in length and 80 miles at its widest was a near impossible endeavor taken as a whole. The determination of those early settlers and the methodical encroachment of one tree at a time, one load of timber at a time, one stump at a time, one field at a time, added up to the man-made, mechanical, agricultural domain we see today. A problem that persists to this day is that the Delta is a very insulated place. Very few new people come to settle and work among us. This wasn't the case in the beginning when immigrants from all over the Western world were enticed with promises of jobs, good homes, and fair wages. In reality, there were already quite enough people to do the work, but I'm convinced that the people in charge would have been okay with running all the blacks out and replacing them with Italians or Chinese or Syrians, whom they looked upon not as technically white, but certainly closer than African Americans. My guess is that they figured they could get more work out of these new immigrants and they would be more pliable and reasonable. With ethnic group after ethnic group, the ploy didn't work. After a season of working a cotton crop, these folks did whatever they could to set up businesses, most times to do business with black people. The Italians ran cafes and got a toehold on the bootlegging and later the legal liquor store business. The Syrians started as peddlers and quickly became shopkeepers. The Jewish saw a niche and went from selling rags out of a cart to owning dry goods stores all over the Delta, and the Chinese settled in as grocers, anything but working in the cotton fields. World War II changed the racial dynamic in America. Racial attitudes were changing and a new type of segregation was on the rise. At the end of World War II, African Americans were faced with the new reality of ethnic groups such as Italians, the Jewish, Greeks, and others who had previously not been viewed as white, becoming legitimized and welcomed into the mainstream of American life. At the same time, new Jim Crow laws and ever-strengthening opposition to the acceptance of black people to share in the American dream was a new order of the day. The war, which many hoped would finally cause America to grant true equality to all, was a step backward for the African American community. My problem was trying to square the fact that so many people were okay that their fellow human beings were, for the most part, locked in this horrific daily struggle for survival. Somehow we normalized it. Where I grew up, to see some of the worst poverty on the planet, one simply had to look out the window or walk down a street. Black children dressed in rags, an inordinate number of umbilical hernias on little kids, women hauling 5-gallon buckets of water from a common spigot down the way, all within sight of some of the most conspicuous consumption you can imagine. It's still that way, though many African Americans have figured out how to navigate the reality of the system and share in the bounty. Education and the vote have been the means to a better life. The recognition that with a little organization and cooperation, most Delta counties could be run by African Americans, from sheriff to tax collector, to supervisor to school board, thereby setting the course and reaping the benefits from state and federal government programs. It's still a struggle when the state legislature won't accept federal monies due to some vague principle that generally has its genesis in conservative church doctrine or in the belief that the entire country is out to get Mississippi. Will it ever change? Who knows? I do know this. The country is not thinking about Mississippi, at least not in that way. I think the people who run things will continue to shoot themselves in the foot at every opportunity. The Anomaly of the Delta by Willie Bearden.